In the muted glow of an early evening, Derek Lawson stepped through the glass doors of one of his own bank's branches, his plain navy shirt and well-worn jeans disguising a secret purpose. Once, he had stood behind the counter as a college student juggling long shifts and restless nights. Now, as the chief executive of this venerable institution, he never allowed himself the luxury of isolation in a sterile corner office. Instead, he roamed these halls incognito, seeking the unvarnished truth hidden between routine transactions and whispered conversations. Tonight, an unsettling murmur had drawn him back to his old stomping ground, a murmur that would soon unravel more than a few spreadsheets ever could. He had built his career on grit, not privilege, a steady climb from a part-time teller grappling with impatient customers to a CEO who refused to trust mere numbers for a complete story. The polished quarterly reports and profit margins, though reassuring on paper, could never capture the real heartbeat of his branch, the quiet, exhausted confessions exchanged in break rooms after grueling shifts. And so, every few months, Derek shed the weight of his title, becoming just another patron stepping into the bank with the guise of normality. Tonight's visit found him at a modest outpost in Columbus, Ohio, a branch that, by all conventional measures, was thriving. The ledgers boasted stable profits and customer satisfaction was high, yet the atmosphere held a secret dissonance, a note of discord only discernible to those who listened beyond the surface. As he ambled in, blending seamlessly with the few late-afternoon customers, Derek couldn't help but notice the clinical chill of the fluorescent lights overhead and the hum of the overzealous air conditioning, as if even the building itself were trying to erase the strains of human labor. Behind the counter, tellers moved with the efficiency of well-rehearsed automatons. A middle-aged gentleman fumbled with his debit card while attempting to explain his predicament, and a young woman offered a polite smile that didn't quite reach the weary depths of her eyes. In the shadowed recesses near the back, a manager in a stiff gray suit lingered, his posture too rigid, his gaze too scrutinizing, exuding an unsettling air of omnipresent control. It was then that Derek caught a sound, a soft, stifled cry that broke through the hum of routine, like a single, desperate note in an otherwise monotonous chord. Drawn by the haunting sound, Derek's eyes drifted toward a partially open door leading to the break room. There, in the dim light, he glimpsed a young woman seated at a small table. Her head hung low and her fingers gripped the edge of the worn tabletop, as if anchoring herself in a storm of unspoken anguish. A colleague hovered nearby, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The words, "You can't let him. He doesn't own you," followed by a tremulous, "Jasmine, what choice do I have? If I don't do what he says, I'm gone," struck Derek like a bolt from the blue. This was no mere moment of customer frustration, this was a cry of personal despair, a raw testament to a deeper tyranny lurking within these walls. Caught in that moment, Derek's mind raced. Should he intervene directly, shattering his undercover guise and risking the fragile trust of those around him? Or should he observe, collecting the threads of this disturbing tapestry until he could weave them into a case for change? For a heartbeat, he remained rooted at the teller's counter, his eyes fixed on the trembling figure in the break room. The pain in her posture was unmistakable, a silent plea that spoke of more than a bad day at work. It spoke of being trapped under the iron grip of a superior whose control went far beyond routine management. Derek's thoughts were interrupted by a brief conversation at the counter. A young teller, Kenny, by the modest name on his badge, briefly met Derek's gaze. With a tentative smile, Kenny asked, "Do you work in banking?" A flash of reminiscence crossed Derek's eyes as he replied lightly, "I used to be a teller, many years ago." The admission stirred something in Kenny, a mix of relief and reluctance, as his eyes darted toward the foreboding presence of the manager. In a hushed tone, Kenny confided, "Our branch manager, he's not just strict. He makes you work late, especially Jasmine. Sometimes, it's like he pushes you until there's nothing left." The words spilled out in quiet confession, laden with the kind of resignation that only comes from long-term subjugation. Even as Kenny returned to his tasks, Derek's inner resolve solidified. This wasn't about the occasional inconvenience or a difficult customer, it was about a systematic abuse of power. He needed to know exactly what was happening behind those fluorescent walls. Quietly, he excused himself from the counter, his posture calm yet determined, and drifted toward a vantage point near the loan officer's desk. From here, his gaze had a clear, unyielding view of the break room. Inside, Jasmine had wiped away her tears and was sitting upright now, yet her hands trembled as if they bore the weight of silent pleas. The young man beside her spoke with urgent softness, his head shaking in an attempt to comfort her. And then, as if summoned by fate, the manager, whose calculated, predator-like steps betrayed his true nature, approached. With each measured stride, his presence filled the room like a gathering storm. The moment Jasmine caught sight of him, her entire body stiffened. In a hurried, almost desperate motion, she stuffed her phone into her pocket and stood as if caught in a clandestine act. Derek's heart pounded as he realized that what he was witnessing was not an isolated incident of workplace stress, but a dynamic of fear and control that had become all too common. Determined to unravel the mystery, he lingered near the break room door, watching every detail as the tension in the room grew palpable, a silent battle between authority and vulnerability. His instincts urged him to speak up, but his undercover role demanded subtlety. Instead, he sought out another confidant, a quiet employee named Miles, busy organizing a stack of deposit slips near the side counter. "Excuse me, do you have a pen?" Derek asked casually, watching Miles startle slightly before complying. Lowering his voice, he leaned in and said, "I couldn't help but notice your friend looks far from okay. Is everything all right?" Miles's eyes shifted nervously toward the manager, and after a heavy pause he murmured, "She's not fine. It's her personal business, but she's been under a lot of pressure." His words, laced with fear, confirmed Derek's suspicions. Jasmine wasn't merely overwhelmed, she was ensnared in a cycle of intimidation. Before Derek could press further, the air around them thickened as the manager's calculated approach became unmistakable. A man in his 40s, impeccably dressed in a crisp suit that seemed to mirror his cold demeanor, halted near the side where Derek stood. The badge on his lapel read Ron Halverson. His eyes were sharp and his expression unnervingly composed, as if he derived a perverse pleasure from the control he wielded. The shift in the room was instantaneous, every sound seemed to pause as if awaiting the inevitable confrontation. Derek's decision was made in that charged moment. He knew that the silence of compliance was no longer acceptable. With deliberate calm, he excused himself from the side and stepped toward the teller counter, his movements measured and unhurried despite the storm of emotions churning within him. As he approached, Kenny, still behind the counter, looked up with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "How's your day going?" Derek asked with a disarming smile, his tone light yet laced with the gravity of the situation. Kenny's reply was a brief, forced "It's been good," but his posture betrayed his tension, shoulders tight, fingers hesitating over the keyboard as he processed Derek's unexpected presence. Suddenly, as if provoked by Derek's steady gaze, Kenny's voice rose slightly. "Do you work in a branch often?" he ventured, before quickly retracting the question as his eyes flicked nervously toward the ever-watchful manager. Derek's reply was measured, "I know this place inside out, I once started as a teller." His tone was both reassuring and heavy with unspoken memories. Kenny's face shifted, a fleeting mixture of relief and dread playing across his features, but before any further questions could be asked, Kenny slid a receipt across the counter and murmured, "Here you go, sir." Derek accepted the receipt with a knowing nod, then lowered his voice, "Take care of yourself, Kenny." In that brief exchange, a silent understanding passed between them, a recognition of the invisible battles waged behind every polished facade. Stepping away from the counter, Derek made his way back toward the exit. Though his feet betrayed his inner resolve, he was not leaving until he uncovered the full extent of the distress simmering beneath the bank's orderly veneer. Instead, he paused near the loan officer's desk, feigning a casual glance at his phone, but his eyes never strayed from the break room. There, Jasmine now sat at a table with her posture strained in an effort to mask the tremor of fear, while the young man beside her pleaded in urgent whispers. The manager, Ron Halverson, advanced with a predator's precision, his eyes locked on them as if marking his territory. At that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Derek's internal alarm blared. This was no ordinary managerial oversight, it was a calculated abuse of power. His gaze swept the room, landing on Miles again, whose hand clutched a bundle of slips as if for support. Quietly, Derek approached him. "Miles," he said, his tone soft but insistent, "what exactly is happening here?" Miles's eyes darted once more toward Halverson, then dropped to the floor. She's been working here just over a year now," he began, voice barely above a whisper, "but it's not normal. She's unhappy, trapped, even. He makes her stay late alone, and when he calls her into his office, she tenses up like she's expecting punishment." A slow, heavy silence fell between them as Miles's words sank in. Derek's heart tightened. This was not a case of an overworked employee, it was a case of a predator exploiting the vulnerability of someone who had no easy way out. As if on cue, the air shifted imperceptibly, and Halverson himself strode over, his presence silencing any further murmurs. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone smooth yet carrying an undercurrent of threat. Miles, eyes wide and voice trembling, replied, "Yes, sir, just assisting a customer." The brevity of the answer hung in the air like a poorly concealed secret. Derek's jaw clenched. He had seen enough. In that moment, his decision crystallized. He would no longer stand by while an abuse of power went unchecked. With a deep, steadying breath, he strode up to Halverson, who now exuded a mixture of controlled irritation and barely concealed anxiety. Their eyes locked, a silent battle of wills unfolding in the charged space between them. "Good evening," Derek said, his voice calm yet imbued with authority. In one fluid motion, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a sleek executive badge. The glint of its emblem under the harsh fluorescent lights left no room for ambiguity. "I'm Derek Lawson, CEO of this bank," he declared. The words rang out, shattering the fragile calm of the lobby. Customers, employees, and even Halverson himself seemed to freeze in disbelief. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning, punctuating the gravity of the revelation. Halverson's face, previously a mask of controlled arrogance, fell into an expression of stunned vulnerability. I didn't expect," he stammered, his carefully maintained composure crumbling as he struggled for words. Before he could muster a response, Derek's steady gaze cut through the silence. "I know exactly what's been happening here," he said, voice low and resolute. "I know about the late shifts, the undue pressure, and the way you've been treating your employees, especially Jasmine." His words were measured but carried the weight of years spent witnessing the quiet suffering of those beneath him. At that precise moment, a recording crackled from Derek's phone, filling the room with the raw, trembling voice of a distressed employee. "If I don't do what he says, I'm gone." The audio was soon followed by the gentle yet firm admonition of another coworker, "Jasmine, you can't let him. He doesn't own you." The evidence was irrefutable. Halverson's face drained of color as the reality of his abuse was laid bare before the entire branch. With a decisive tap, Derek dialed corporate HR and declared, "You're done. You will never work in this industry again." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Halverson, now visibly trembling, could only nod mutely as his power evaporated before the eyes of a stunned audience. Employees exchanged glances, some incredulous, others hopeful, as Derek addressed them directly. "Everyone," he said, his voice steady yet compassionate, "you've been working under someone who didn't deserve his position. Tonight, everything changes. Jasmine, you're safe now. And to all of you, if you ever feel trapped or silenced, speak up. Leadership isn't about wielding power, it's about responsibility and protecting one another." His words, soft yet resolute, reverberated through the hushed room, igniting a spark of defiance against a system long resigned to injustice. In the ensuing quiet, Miles broke his silence. "Sir, this isn't just about one bad manager," he offered, his voice gaining strength. "It's the pressure, the fear that if we speak up, we lose everything. We've been forced into silence for far too long." Kenny nodded in agreement, his earlier nervousness now tempered by a burgeoning resolve. Even Jasmine, though still trembling, seemed to gather a small measure of courage in the wake of Derek's proclamation. Derek met their eyes, each one reflecting years of unspoken pain and the tentative hope of change. "From this moment on," he continued, "this branch is under direct review. We will not only replace those who abuse their power, but we will transform the very culture that allowed it to flourish. Transparency, trust, and the willingness to stand up for each other are the cornerstones of true leadership, and I need your help to build that here." His words hung in the air, heavy with promise and the weight of responsibility. Later that night, as the branch slowly emptied and employees began to lock up, Derek sat in his car watching from a distance. Jasmine, Miles, and Kenny lingered together outside, their conversation subdued yet filled with a cautious optimism. The weight of years of silent suffering was beginning to lift, replaced by a fragile but unmistakable sense of solidarity. Derek ran a hand over his face, his mind swirling with thoughts of all the branches, all the employees, who had suffered under similar conditions, hidden behind tidy reports and efficient transactions. In that quiet moment, as the cool evening air mingled with the lingering tension of the day, Derek realized that being a leader was never about controlling numbers on a spreadsheet. It was about safeguarding the human spirit against exploitation, ensuring that no one ever felt so powerless as to be voiceless. Sometimes, he thought, all it takes is one person to break the cycle. And tonight, that person had spoken up. If you ever find yourself trapped in a situation where someone wields their power to silence or control, remember this story. Speak up. Reach out. because true change begins with the courage to say, enough. And if this tale resonates with you, share it. After all, you never know who might need to hear that a single voice can indeed shatter the silence.